Okay. At this time, I'd like to call the regularly scheduled Audit Committee meeting of the Plaquemines Parish Council to order at 9:30 a.m. on May the 9th, 2019, and the machine is open for roll call. Let the record reflect that all members are present. Mr. Duke here representing the Audit Department. We have guests in the audience from the Recreation Department, the Director, Mr. Epley, and we also have Mr. Corey Arbrough here, who's making a special request of the committee today. So with that, we'd like to move forward. Would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge the allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all for coming this morning. We'll move right on to new business.
A discussion of the follow-up internal audit of the civil service.
Okay, what we're going to do this morning, what I'd like to do for the committee is review the Civil Service Department follow-up audit that was done on April 13th, 2018. We'll go over a little bit of the background. In accordance with the Plaquemines Parish Government Charter, Section 7.08, Audit Committee and the Internal Audit Department Charter, the Internal Auditor has performed a follow-up audit on the recommendations made in the Internal Audit Report dated April 13th, 2018. The objective, scope, and methodology. Internal Audit Standard 2500.A1 states, the Chief Internal Audit Executive must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions concerning the recommendations of the auditor have been effectively implemented, or that senior management has accepted the risk of not taking the recommendations. The objective was to determine the status of the auditor's recommendations as of April 13th, 2018. The scope included the Civil Service Department Internal Audit Report as of the same date. My methodology was the internal auditor reviewed the internal auditor's report recommendations and the status of its recommendation as of April 13, 2018, with the Director of Civil Service to determine compliance with Audit Standard 2500.A1. This audit was conducted in accordance with the Internal Auditor's Standards for Professional Practice of Internal Auditing, the Red Book. Let us now go to page 4 of the report. And this is my conclusion and a summary of my recommendations. In my opinion, the recommendations listed below will improve internal controls and reduce the risk of a negative event from happening. The summary of the auditor's recommendations are as follows. Employee hiring process. During the interviews, candidates should be tested to help ensure that they have the necessary experience to fulfill the duties and responsibilities as stated in their job description. Status, management agrees. Number 2, Rule 8, working tests. The appointing authority and the employee supervisor should work together and closely monitor probationary employees. Since the supervisor works with the employee on a daily basis, the appointing authority should make every effort to support the supervisor's evaluation unless there's sufficient documentation otherwise. If it's determined by the appointing authority and the supervisor that probationary employee is not doing his job, Civil Service Rule 8, Working Test, Section 1.1 should be implemented in a timely manner. In addition, it appears that training on employee evaluations would be helpful to management. Status, a meeting to discuss training has occurred between the Civil Service, Human Resources, Finance, and Administration. Budget approval by the parish council may be needed to consider this.
Mr. Duke,
Yes, sir.
what I'm gathering out of these first couple of comments are that the Civil Service Department is very cooperative, but I'm reading in this, and they're interested in training or having the supervisors trained to be able to evaluate employees correctly.
In a better fashion. Yes, correctly and in a better fashion. They think they need more training. When I was doing this audit, that was one of the things that we discussed, is that the director and I agreed that it doesn't appear that everyone understands the evaluation process.
And to me, that's been a long-standing problem in the civil service system in Plaquemines Parish, that evaluations are not properly done in many cases. And the reason I cite that is because some time ago we had some statistics to show that out of the 600 employees, we might have had one or two poor evaluations.
That's correct. My sample showed that that was a concern, and training is needed.
And it also says it needs a budget to do that.
And you need, that's exactly. It's going to cost money just like everything.
Thank you.
Okay. Number 3, the funding of positions and layoffs. Better communication is needed between the parish president, council, civil service director, and the Civil Service Commission to resolve any misunderstandings and any differences in the interpretations of the Civil Service Commission rules. Every effort should be made to avoid spending taxpayers' funds on attorney fees and court cases. Status of the recommendation: communication has improved with the new administration. The case with employee A is still in litigation. Policies and procedures. A Civil Service Department policies and procedures manual should be implemented. These procedures can help future employees understand the civil service operations and to help reduce the risk that civil service would operate in an inefficient and ineffective manner from employees that may not have the necessary experience and knowledge to operate the Civil Service Department on a daily basis without policy guidance. Status of recommendation: procedure manual is deemed necessary and will be a priority when time permits. Number 5, Civil Service Director supervision. If there are any differences with how the Civil Service Director is being supervised and the operations of the Civil Service Department, these differences should be discussed and resolved independently with the Civil Service Commission. Management agreed.
And when we speak of management, we're speaking of the Civil Service Department Director.
That's correct.
Okay. And it seems to be that they're very agreeable.
Yeah, it was a good audit, I thought. We got some controls in place that I think, like I said in the beginning, will mitigate risk. Number 6, timesheets and time cards. The Civil Service Department is tracking and monitoring employee time in an efficient and effective manner. There was no recommendation was in play there, so there's no status to take a look at. They're doing a good job with that. Internal auditor's job description. I think this is a good one. This job description should require the chief internal auditor to have a working knowledge of the internal audit environment at least 5 to 8 years. Status: as previous Civil Service Director, changes were made as approved by Appointing Authority Councilmember Burt. Any other changes as suggested may need Appointing Authority approval. Donation of sick leave. Update the Civil Service rule on donations to ensure that employee donations are notarized. Review the cost-benefit to determine if adding this control is beneficial to PPG. Civil Service Department did some research on this, and their opinion is that the cost would be more than a benefit of putting this control in place. Sick leave continued. In my opinion, the civil service rule for donation needs clarification and updating. The intent of the employee donating sick or annual leave to an employee was not for that employee to make a profit. It appears that excess leave was caused in part by requiring the employee to exhaust all annual and sick leave before the employee donated leave was approved and started. Ensure that employee annual and sick leave has been exhausted before approving this. There are numerous provisions in the Civil Code setting forth requirements for a valid donation. However, to minimize attorney fees and council members' time, it seems the following two requirements could be determined before going forward. Civil Code Article 1519, which prohibits donations which are contrary to law or morals. Civil Code Article 1536, which requires a donation of a corporal to be notarized in front of two witnesses. Status: donation of sick leave will be processed on a biweekly basis, at which time only the amount needed to make 80 hours will be processed. This process would keep the employee whole and avoid any overages of time that would occur because of unforeseen circumstances.
So just to take a minute on that.
Yes, sir.
In the past, we've had conflicting application of donations of sick leave.
Right, yeah. What was
And
happening was
Could you speak into the mic, Mr. Duke?
what was happening was the annual and sick leave was not being exhausted, just like I said, before they were donating sick leave or annual leave. So what would happen, sometimes they'd have on the books, they would have, say, 80 hours of sick leave and annual leave, and they would be donated another 30 or 40 hours added on to that. But that's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to have zero and then donate it.
And I believe we've had some cases where some people were denied to be even accept.
Yes, that did happen in several cases. I thought it was quite unfair.
Okay. But they have agreed to stick to the policy and move.
They're not gonna donate unless the employees have exhausted their time.
Okay. Thank you.
Does the parish have short-term and long-term disability?
I believe it does. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of, and I thought too, there was one instance I thought, like for maternity leave, you get a whole lot of time for maternity leave, and in one instance, and this is what kind of brought this up, that individual not only had maternity leave, but they also donated 150 hours of donated leave to that person. So I thought that was odd.
I know in the private world, where I work, you can keep up to 200 hours of sick leave
Right.
after you use.
Yeah, well, I think, in my opinion, like I said, you're not supposed to profit from this rule. And you should, if you need it, you don't have anything left, then I think the donation is valid. Otherwise, it's not.
Conclude your comments. Okay.
Number 10, custody of employee records. Management should authorize the Civil Service Department and our Human Resources to have custody of the employee records. The parish president is the CEO of Plaquemines Parish and should determine who has custody of these records. They agree.
So this has been an issue for some time now, whether or not the parish president's office should have the records, and they're agreeing now that the parish president should be custodian of the records, and
As the authority, yes, sir.
so they're willing to work with us on that.
That's what it seemed, yep.
Thank you.
Staffing requirements. In accordance with Louisiana State Constitution, section under Appropriations B, the Civil Service Department should be adequately staffed. Status: meetings have been held with parish council members to propose an introduction of the members in hopes of being granted a resolution which would fund a clerical position in that department. Number 12, the assistant auditor's job description. The assistant auditor's job description should be revised to require at least 2 to 4 years of internal audit experience in that environment. Not CPA work, not any other kind of work, in the internal auditing environment. And at least have a certified internal auditor certification. Agreed.
And so how do we move forward to improve that that requirement?
I think it has to go before the council to change this job description.
So can we have an ordinance prepared, or whatever legislation prepared, to request that civil service do that, and let the committee review that legislation and
Yes,
make the
sir.
recommendation to the council?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we'll look forward to that coming down in the future.
Yes, sir. That concludes my follow-up audit.
Now, do we have any further questions on the follow-up audit? It seems to me that the working relationship between the Civil Service Department, and obviously it's stated in the audit of the administration, is getting better. And I would hope that they continue to have that positive attitude to be able to fill positions, advertise positions in a timely manner, those that are funded, and that way we can, at least provide the services that we can fund, although we don't have enough funding to provide everything we need, but what we do have, we should be able to fulfill those positions. So
Yes, sir.
I think that's a good positive step. Anything else anyone has on this?
No.
None? All right, well, thank you for that. We'll move to the next item.
2B, discussion of auditing the Parks and Recreation Department is requested by council members Black and Albro.
Okay, as you know, we've had request, and I distributed this request. One was on the front page of the Gazette that was requested us to audit, and then Mr. Albro sent an email out on May the 7th at 5:24 p.m. asking that the recreation audit be moved up. I think we had discussion at the last meeting that we were willing to consider adding this to our list. You have before you today a list of audits and our annual plan and scheduled. We also have a resolution before us to discuss to add the Parks and Recreation Department to the schedule itself. Now, I know Mr. Albro is in the audience. If you would like to make some comments as to why you believe the risk assessment is valued to be moved up ahead of the annual plan, we'd be glad to hear your comments.
Yes, sir. Based on my email after our finance meeting we had, going through all the departments with budget shortfalls, which was also on my request, not only the recreation department, but going through all the departments with budget shortfalls, just having go through with a fine-tooth comb looking for some options. There was some mentions of going up on fees for different activities and things. So but before we can do that as council members, I feel it's necessary to get a better picture of exactly what's going on in the recreation department.
So do you, I mean, your request is that should move the recreation department up on the priority list. So I guess what we're looking for, and Mr. Duke, perhaps you can weigh in on this, is there a higher risk in that department than the schedule that we already have?
If we take a look, let's take a look at the schedule, the risk assessment that we have now. And let me say this. I wanted to bring this to the committee. I do think that we need to, I'm going to be doing a risk assessment towards the end of this year. And I think that we need to try to adhere to my judgment on the audits and the judgment of management and the council when I do my risk assessment. And we should adhere to those particular audits for the most part for that year. This is the way I've always done it before. However, the way I've done it before is that we've left space for 2 or 3 special request audits from management. If a big risk comes up, if something really hot potato comes up, we throw it in there. So that being said, I would request that the committee consider that when we do our risk assessment at the end of the year. My risk assessment, as well as some of these, were special requests. In fact, a number of these were special request examinations, and such as the water department. And it turned out that that was a good risk. It was a high risk, and we got a lot of controls in place, and I think there was a lot of good work done with that. Grants, which is number 2. Grants is always a high risk for things going wrong. So I think that was a good suggestion by the committee. That was a special request audit as well. And so that's what I'm working on now. Contracts is always a high-risk area, and that's part of my risk assessment I did in 2018 and 19. Timekeeping and overtime, high risk for this whole area. You've got to consider that. Property and leases. I've asked questions about that. I'm not really certain if Plaquemine Parish really knows what they have at this time, making that a very high risk. Purchasing is always, disbursements is always a high risk. You have to take a look at that. Boat harbors, people are telling me that that's a high risk as well. And my examination and my judgment, when we went over these, I had a meeting with several people, administration, other department heads. One department head didn't show up, but most of the directors I had a meeting with when I first got here, and we devised all this, and everybody agreed to it, that these were areas that they wanted me to look at. And I agreed too, because I looked at the policies. The policies are the controls, and I thought these were good choices. Boat harbors, ambulances, firefighting, especially with the volunteer fire department. You got to look at that. Community Action Agency, they have grants, so we have to look at that as well. Now, that being said, I appreciate the idea that the council member thinks is a risk with the recreation department. That's a good thing to consider, and I hope the committee considers it. But I don't think at this time we should put the recreation department way above all these others that we need to try to do. That's just my opinion. I think that the main risk, and I've done examinations on the recreation department in the past when I was working for Jefferson Parish Inspector General's office, and the main area that we discovered when we looked at recreation was that the booster clubs did not have a whole lot of controls in place, and they dealt with cash. Other than that, there was not enough to warrant the time spent on the recreation department.
So, Mr. Arborough, do you have some insight or knowledge of expanded risk that we should be moving this up?
Well, first, I have 2 questions. One being, when was the last time our recreation department was audited? And also, these audits, how many times have these been done within the last year, or are these multiple years? And I'm sorry, 3 questions. The last one is the audits, the grants department, isn't that audited multiple times by state agencies and other outside agencies as well?
Well, let me address you first of all. Before this audit committee came into being and hired Mr. Duke, there were no audits done for many years. The previous audit committee was dysfunctional, to say the least. The internal auditor did not come to work. There was litigation involved to where the internal auditor at the time did not show up for work for almost a year, and the lawsuit wound up paying her back. She came back to work. The new audit committee took over, held her accountable, and after 6 months she resigned. So to look in the rearview mirror about how many audits were done, it's very simple. 0. You'd have to go back many, many years to see about any audits done to when Mr. Peoples was here as the internal auditor. And what his audits were, they weren't really audits. They were a verification of 500 and over expenditures, and it was nothing like what we are doing today. We have recreated this audit committee to move forward. So to distinguish for your second question is that audits are done by external audits as per the state law. Under our charter, we have a special section where we have our own internal auditor, which is a completely different function.
Understand that? Yes.
And so that function is being administered by this committee and Mr. Duke under the guise, under the authority of the charter. And so if there is overlap, there will be overlap, but one will be an external audit, one will be internal audit. Now, I'm tending to agree with you on the recreation issue since the theft of the rocks. Now, I'm thankful for you to bring that forward so we can perhaps find out what happened to those rocks. Now, depending on what happens in the meeting this afternoon, then I would know better as to where my position would be, whether we should move this audit up or not. Because Parks, Recreations and all would include that. And as you know, at the last meeting, we had discussion. One of the council members brought forward the issue of rocks disappearing, so to speak. That's Parks and Recreations, right on point to what you're saying. So, I mean, unless you have some other information.
Well, I would just like to clarify, this is not a witch hunt for me. It was recommended in discussion to possibly going up on the fees for our citizens to have to pay for their children to do recreation. That spurred all this conversation. I cannot support anything on that matter without having an understanding and a better idea of what's going on within the recreation department from as far as fees, fair across the board, expenditures, again, what the audit committee would ultimately look for in there.
Council member, what I would suggest, it would be very helpful for both of us, if you could
Into the mic.
take a look at the risk areas of the Recreation Department and bring those risks forward to this committee. And based on that risks, we can evaluate whether that risk is a red flag or a higher risk than the audits that we have currently on the board. But you need to, just to be able to say that, well, we want to take a look because these expenditures are either high or low, that's not a risk. That's just an operational financial deal that was probably audited by the external auditors, where you could go to Mr. Surpass and ask him about it and probably get your answer from him rather than spending a whole lot of man hours with the internal audit department looking at that. Now, for instance, what Mr. Rousseau brought up with the rocks, I mean, that could be construed as theft, and that is a high risk. And so if we're going to base this audit on something of that nature, then I would have to say, yeah, we should put this on there and start looking for theft. Other than that, what you're saying is just financial.
And
I guess
let me just follow up on what you're basing your request on. You received this same sheet in that financial meeting that you had.
Correct.
And you chose to pick the recreation, and I guess the question is because we're asking you all of these others, just as the 5 mills property tax was brought up in the subject, to be able to raise fees. Well, raising taxes are just equally as important as raising fees, which all of these other departments will be subsidized by the general fund relief from the property taxes. So that's what I guess we're really asking is if there's a sincere risk there, then we need to know about it so we can move forward with that. But drainage department, well, you got the list. We're running deficits in all of these categories. So.
Right, but from my understanding, recreation is one that had never been audited or many, many years versus some of the others. It was the one we discussed in the meeting. It was the one that was already requested by Councilmember Black. It's one that's near and dear to my heart. That's why I'm here today. I'm not, again, we all know some other issues going on that we would like to have looked at. I'm not going on record right now to say what those are, but it's just a request. That's all. Thank you.
Right, but we want to honor a legitimate request, and that's what we're trying to get what you had enough?
I'm all for putting it on the list, but I'm not for moving it up the list, because if I go just looking at the list, boat harbors, well, you heard what I said the other day, our ordinances say if you're back in rent, you're supposed to be out the harbor. Well, the lady who does the billing for the boat harbors told me there's one in Venice that owes $10,000 and they still in the boat harbor. So there's an ordinance, no shrimp dock's supposed to dock at the shrimp docks. They're supposed to get their own slip. They only could go there for so many hours in a day and move. They all there, and it goes, and
And you identified those. What I'm asking for is
Well,
a professional to identify some issues or areas that we could improve the recreation department. So I feel there's a little bit of a difference. We know what those issues are. We just need to,
tell us what your recreation is. I know it needs to be done. There's money involved and all that, but I got a list of things where the administration could follow. It's already in our rules. And
agree?
And so we have a resolution to add it to our list today. It's not a problem, and we don't mind adding it to the list. But when your request came to move it up, then we're looking for justification to do that. And so at this time, I'd like to offer the following resolution, and it's a resolution to add the audit of the Parks and Recreation Department to the 2018-2019 schedule of audit priorities, and otherwise provide with respect thereto. And I think you each have a copy of that. And I'd like to offer next for a second. Second by Mr. Konovich. Discussion is open on adding the audit to the list. And it would be added at the bottom of the list, just as we add other things. And so, any comments? Ms. Newberry?
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this proposed internal audit list. Thank y'all for agreeing to add it to the list. I think it's also a priority recreation. It needs to be brought up because it involves our whole community. This is what our community is based on, parks and recreations. And as we know, it's a big deficit. Sorry, I might have missed some of the conversation when I stepped out.
And
I think we can bring this back to the table next month. And I think we need to renegotiate this list because Mr. Kognovich and I wasn't here when this resolution was passed last year. So maybe we need to sit down and talk about what are our priorities, if this list is correct. So that's just my...
right. And while you were out, let me reiterate what we discussed. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to determine what the risk factors were on all of these. And Mr. Duke gave a very distinct reasoning why these are on the list. But because of the theft of the rocks or the disappearance of the rocks, then we give credit to these two councilmen's request to look into that theft or that disappearance of the rocks. So I thank them for bringing this forward. But if it's answered today at the council meeting about where those rocks went, then we're looking for something to be able to have a hook on to make it more important than these other items of timekeeping, purchasing, property, boat harbors, ambulances.
Teresa, everything is important. And I understand that the rocks is a big issue, and I agree with you there. But when you're losing over $1 million in recreation, that's also very important. It's important to the people. It's not the fact what's important to us, because I see your agenda on that. It's what's important to the people. And I think the people would want to see the recreation department get audited. So we know how to assess what's best, whether we're going to raise fees, whether we're not going to raise fees. That's just my opinion.
And I agree with that opinion and that thought, but my thought process is not that narrow. It's broader because we're looking at exactly all of the losses. We lost $1 million in recreation. We lost $3 million in buildings. We lost $1.4 million in drainage. Roads and bridges, $1.4 million. So it's just one of a list. Now, I understand there are people that want a single shot at the recreation department, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of what you're really looking for, because if you're looking for revamping or reorganization, we have Mr. Epley in the audience who we can call on and see if he has any ideas. But to actually get into the audit of it, we value audits based on risk, and that's why Mr. Duke gave the presentation that he gave. And I'm not opposed to auditing the recreation, parks and recreation grounds and all of that. But there's something driving this effort for recreation department, and I'm trying to get to the reasoning so I can buy in. And so, Mr. Epley, do you have anything to add to this? Because we definitely have worked with you on the Waterworks Department audit. We're willing to work with you on the Recreation Department audit. So I'm trying to find out in my mind why I would want to vote to bump the other audits that are already on the annual list, such as I just mentioned, such as timekeeping and overtime. You know, we can look at timekeeping and overtime. We can start with the council members and come right on down about timekeeping and overtime and who shows up for work and who doesn't, and when they come and when they go. We can do that. We can take purchasing. As he said, we can look at purchasing, and we can see if the contracts and the purchasing is right. All of these things are important, but, Mr. Epley, do you have anything
Yes,
to
sir.
add?
I don't have anything to add. As far as the Recreation Department, they're, in charge of parks. We also know that they're in charge of the Davant Pool. We know we have issues at the Davant Pool that have to be resolved. I'm working on those issues right now. As far as the fees and things that the Recreation Department collects, it doesn't amount to a whole lot of money, because it's just fees collected from kids to baseball registrations and football registrations. So no, I don't have anything to add to it, sir.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that it's a high-risk area for us to move ahead of the other things that I just mentioned?
No, sir, I don't.
Okay. And, you know, if you do find something that is a high risk, then we'd ask you that you report it to us so we can make that evaluation and we can take the proper steps to move it up.
I absolutely would.
Thank you for your cooperation.
You're welcome.
Because we don't need an audit to go up on fees.
Right.
It's quick for everybody to go to different parishes, say, oh, Jefferson charges this, Orleans charges that. Do it for recreation. And we need to get away from the Vance pool, my pool, Port Sulphur's pool. When I got the money for my Burris's pool, they said, oh, we got money for your pool. It's not my pool, it's Plaquemines Parish's pool. So it shouldn't be separated. I'm working to help everybody on this board do whatever they need in their districts. And I don't consider it my pool, it's Plaquemines Parish's pool.
So we have a resolution on the table to add the Parks and Recreation Department to the schedule of auditing. Is there any further comment on the resolution? Hearing none, the machine is open. And the resolution is adopted 3-0. So thank you for your input, Mr. Albro. We've added your request to the list, and we'll look forward to getting there eventually. Any further comments? If not, we'll move to what's next on the agenda.
Audits in progress. Number
Mr. Duke?
3A.
Yes, sir.
3A1, internal audit of the grant process.
I have, as you all know, I have started the grant process internal audit. Trying to get this out for the committee as soon as possible. I'm going to be looking at a lot of invoices in the coming days and concentrating on incurred expenses, and also some compliance areas with the owners of the property who got the elevations. I'm going to be checking into those areas as well. Kind of take a look at this, let the committee know a little bit where I am with this. Let's see here. Yeah, this audit is a financial and compliance internal audit of Plaquemines Parish Government, who is the sub-grantee of the Elevation, Reconstruction, and Acquisition Grant Project. This internal audit will focus on the grant's expenses and supporting documentation. As I said, it's ongoing. I hope to have it out in June or July of this year.
And this contract is like $12-14 million contract?
It's a little over 14 million.
So $14 million.
Well, I did, the way I did it, sir, was they gave me a listing of all the grants. And I took one of the highest dollar amounts, and that was this one. and just going to go from there. So it's really only one grant that I'm looking at, but this is a big grant. It's one of the ordinances. The original ordinance was done in 2013, then there was a second ordinance done in 2017.
The reason I asked back 8 years ago or so, being the president of the Historical Association, I filled out some paperwork for the grant, sent it in. Secretary called me up wanting to know what I did with the money.
Yes.
When I get the money, I'll let you know.
Right.
Well, somebody got it, and when I complained to a council member, about a week later, we got the check.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments.
So the grant that you're working on now is an elevation grant, which deals with many houses that are being...
Many, many houses, that's correct. Yep.
Anything else? Any further discussion on the item? Any questions? Hearing none. Does that complete your presentation, Mr. Duke?
Yes, sir, it does.
Any further business to come before us today? I'd like to move to approve the minutes of the April 11, 2019 meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Newberry. Any comments or discussion on the adoption of the April 11, 2019 meeting minutes? Hearing none. Machine is open. Let the record reflect that the minutes are adopted 3-0. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Mr. Davich, by Ms. Newberry. Machine is open on adjournment. And the meeting is adjourned at 10:11 a.m. Thank you all this morning for coming.